Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to QA Cafe's webinar this afternoon. My name is Joe McAkron. I'm the founder and CEO of QA Cafe and the original creator of CDRouter. And we're super excited today to be talking to you about our latest add-on, CDRouter Performance. And we're going to be talking about how you can measure the CPE performance using CDRouter. So we're talking about some of the challenges with CPE performance testing, and this is a capability that CDRouter can now offer. But if you look at traditional tools and traditional approaches to performance, pretty much the goal is to look at, am I getting line rate traffic? Depending on what your physical interfaces are, whether you're talking wireless or wired, am I getting line rate? And often you're not very focused on the functionality of the device. So while you're forwarding traffic, you're pretty much ignoring real world functions that might be happening on the DUT. Well, what we've seen is that performance issues can actually be impacted by normal user activity. So if you look at a number of conditions that can occur, memory fragmentation, memory leaks, software bugs, all of these can have major impacts on performance. And so you want to understand, does any of my functionality impact the performance over time? How can I isolate the cause of performance issues? And you really need a way to test performance in a realistic environment with functional testing. And that last point is a real key aspect of that's what CDRouter Performance is going to provide you. Alongside of your functional testing, you're now going to have the ability to check your performance. And I want to illustrate this point by jumping right into a performance graph that you're going to be able to generate right out of CDRouter Performance. What you're looking at is we were doing a test from a wired LAN to a wired WAN side with very little functional testing going on. So there's really not much happening. The device connects, gets a DHCP lease, and that's about it. And if you tested this device without any functionality happening, it looks pretty good and it works really well. That's a 9-hour test there where we're checking performance of TCP and UDP, specifically for IPv4, but in both upload and download directions. If we introduce functionality into this, and by functionality I mean other CDRouter test cases that check the DHCP server activity, doing DNS lookups, using real HTTP type applications, you'll see that the performance of this router actually drops off tremendously after a few hours. What's also really interesting is you'll see there's a big difference. TCP performance drops first, and then later UDP performance drops. So in a few moments when we get to our live demo, we'll be able to bring these graphs up. I'll show you how you can generate them right in CDRouter, and you can start to look at this. But this is one of the capabilities of our new add-on, is the tracking of your performance over time as you're doing your functional test. So today we're introducing CDRouter Performance. It's our latest add-on. It fits in with the family of other add-ons that we have for our CDRouter platform. CDRouter Performance will require our NTA 1000 platform, but we're able to go back and support all the way back to our V2 platform, which covers a number of years. So there's a number of devices in the field that will work with our performance add-on. This has really been our most requested feature from customers. People are very familiar with us for functional testing, but usually when we're talking with customers for the first time, they do ask us, can I do performance testing? And the answer is now, yes, you can. It combines functional and performance testing all in one tool, and this covers both wired and wireless. So it's very comprehensive. It lets you do a lot of different things in one test platform. And it's supported on our NTA 1000 hardware. We had a number of design goals for adding performance into CDRouter. We wanted to do something that kept the same user interface. So whether you're working with our web interface or with our CLI, we wanted the model to stay the same. And so that meant creating test cases for each individual performance test, and I'll show you those in a moment. We also wanted to keep the WAN and LAN services running during the performance tests. So if you're looking at TR69 or your device is doing a DNS lookup, we wanted those services to be available even though we're focused on measuring the throughput of your device. We also wanted to track the performance over time. So you might define a test interval where you're going to test your performance for just 60 seconds, but you might be looping that with a number of other tests. And we wanted to track the results over time and give you some graphing capability because we felt like that's where the real interest and the real value is coming from. If you can see a picture of your performance over time, you can see these trends a lot easier than digging through individual log files. And we also wanted to allow you pass-fail results based on these performance numbers. So you can set thresholds, both low thresholds and high thresholds. And if your bandwidth measurement falls below those, we'll fail the test for you. This supports QoS testing. So if you have the ability, for example, to define rate limiting rules, you can use CDRouter Performance now to test those rules and verify, for example, maybe a specific port or a specific IP address shouldn't receive more than 25 megabits of data. Now you can actually test that using CDRouter Performance. So how does it work? Well, we're measuring what's called application throughput, and we measure latency. And this is also called good put by some folks as well. So we're looking at how much data you can move through TCP and UDP connections. And we're using real stateful TCP and UDP connections to do this. We support a number of modes here. So you can do this over IPv4, you can do it over IPv6, you can have VLANs, you can have 10, 100, or gig Ethernet connections, or you can have wireless connections as well. And with our V2, V3, V4, we have a few different wireless cards for different technologies, but they all support doing performance testing. And it's highly configurable, so you can test a very large number of combinations. By adding in performance here, we've added in a whole new capability, so there's really no end to the combinations you could create. You could pick specific functional areas, add some performance, see what happens to your performance while you're doing those functional areas. It's a very interesting way of looking at both your functionality and your performance. We're still using the closed loop model, where CDRouter is typically wrapped around a device under test, might be connected directly on the WAN and then on the LAN sides. And for different networking technologies, you might have other gear involved. It might be a CMTS for cable, you might have DSLAMs, there could be other things in the network, but the general idea is that CDRouter is wrapped around a test device or test network. We're looking at single or bidirectional throughput through the device, measuring latency and using all these different combinations. So you can look at your performance from Ethernet to wireless, wireless to Ethernet. There's a lot of combinations here that you might want to cover. CDRouter Performance is now going to give you some tools to help you isolate performance issues that are related to functionality. So you might pick specific functional areas and combine those with performance tests. And now you can see, does that functional area impact performance at all? You can create pass-fail criteria based on those performance goals or your QoS rules. Now you can start to answer these questions. Does my functionality impact performance at all? People want to know things, for example, if I run TR69, does that impact my performance? Well, now you can start to actually answer some of those questions. And likewise, you can look at the opposite. How does the performance impact my functionality? So when we started doing our testing here, we've seen a whole new batch of failure modes that show up when you present heavier load on the device. It might be that memory gets more fragmented and more issues surface in this type of environment. So you're going to see likely new functional failure modes now that you're placing a lot more load on the devices you're testing. This is going to help you find and resolve the root cause of these performance issues faster and easier. I won't say it's easy because there's still some work to do to understand the root cause of poor performance, but at least you have a tool set that's going to allow you to zero in exactly on specific test cases and how they impact performance. So the results are pretty interesting. We found in our initial testing that a lot of devices work well. They work well when combined with performance and functional testing. They're pretty solid over time, with an occasional dip in performance. But we did find that there are a number of devices that show significant degrading of performance over time, or the protocols start to act in an unexpected manner when presented with load. So it's a really interesting to have this capability and look at everything together. Look at your functional and your performance all in one tool. So we think the results are pretty dramatic, and I want to share with you now a few live results and walk you through a couple specific scenarios so you can get a real sense of how you might be able to do this in your own CD router setups. So I'm going to jump over to a real system here and just pull up BuddyWeb. For those of you that are new to CD router, you're looking at BuddyWeb, which is our web interface. It allows you to connect into your test system, in this case an NTA 1000, and launch your tests all through the web environment. There's a configuration file that describes the device you're testing and its capabilities. And there's a package that allows you to select test cases and rules, or select how you would like to run those test cases. I'm just going to select a package here and show you that the new CDRouter Performance is delivered as an add-on. So if you see, we have a list of all of our add-ons here. We have our core set of test cases that contains over 600 test cases. And then we have each individual add-on. So performance, you might select a couple new test cases. For example, maybe I want to run NAT tests, and then I want to combine that with performance. And we've organized things into a V4 and V6 modules for performance. So I'll just select the V4 ones. And by default, we'll look at TCP and UDP and a few other interesting performance tests for you. But you can select individual tests if you want to. And we feel like it's going to be a lot interesting for people to look at looping. So maybe you're going to do this over a certain number of times, or you're just going to say run forever and come in here and stop it. You can also set up different rules about when to stop and how long to run your test cases. But primarily, looping is going to allow you to track your results over time. So why don't we just go in? I have a result or a test package here where I'm doing wireless testing to the WAN side. I'm just going to restart this and show you what an actual test looks like. So one of the things about CDRouter Performance is the user model stays the same. So if you're familiar with the startup sequence where we're bringing up the WAN and LAN, all of that happens normally. Now when we get to the point of actually wanting to run a performance test, we're going to put the interfaces involved in that performance test in what we call a performance mode. So you will see that depending on whether you're using wireless or wired, there may be some other steps involved in getting that performance or getting that interface ready for performance. So let's just see here. I'm just going to click on the first performance, and we see some log messages. Since this is a wireless test, we're actually bringing up the wireless interface now in a performance mode, so you'll see it reconnect. And now what you're seeing is the actual performance intervals, and then it stopped pretty quickly. We only did a 30-second, or a 10-second performance test. So let me just back up here and show you what you're looking at. So if you're familiar with a CDRouter log, we would normally show you all the packets that we send and receive. For example, here's an ARP request that we received on the WAN. When we're doing a performance test, we are not showing you all the traffic that's occurring on the link, whether it be the WAN or LAN. You might be running gigabit interfaces. There could be a lot of traffic here. And just recording and displaying that traffic in a web browser in this format will have an impact on the actual performance number. So we're not displaying that. If you were to take a capture file of the link, you would see that traffic. And in fact, we do have an option for still generating the capture file, which you would see up here if you would like to view that. And in fact, I do have captures turned on, and I have this system working with one of our CloudShark systems. So let me just stop one of those tests. So if you did want to look at the full captures, you could send it over to a system like CloudShark, and that should open up. There we go. So you could look at the actual traffic involved here. So here are all the TCP packets involved with that particular performance test. And you see there's a lot of them. CloudShark will make it easier when you're dealing with larger captures. So this isn't really even a large capture here at 30 meg. But if you wanted to deal with the larger captures, you can do that a little more easily in CloudShark. So by default, we're turning off captures on the data section for our performance tests, but it is something you can turn on. So if I go back here, you'll see, just to review what we're looking at in the log, we're going to display in our interval, this particular test has 10 different streams, so we're displaying each stream in here. And we're displaying the performance results. So you see each stream here is using just a little bit of bandwidth, and there's a summary of that. So if you look at this overall, this is wireless, and you'll see it's a little bit choppy where it was 5 megabits 1 second, it was 28 megabits another second. This is just running in our lab here where there's a lot of stuff going on. Since wireless is a shared medium, other traffic can have a huge impact on the results. In fact, if I just look at a previous result here of some wireless activity over a longer time, you'll see that the performance can vary quite a bit. In fact, when you start to look at wireless, you'll see UDP is going to have a higher performance where it doesn't need acknowledgement, where TCP is going to have lower performance, it does need acknowledgement, and you also have the 802.11 acknowledgement as well. So there's a lot going on in the wireless side, and you tend to see bandwidth can be a little bit choppy if you're comparing that to just straight Ethernet. If I go back to earlier today, I showed you a couple graphs where we were looking at performance, and you'll see these graphs for performance live under the visualize option in BuddyWeb. There's a new view performance option. So if you're tracking your bandwidth, it's something where you can visit that button and it'll show you. Here's an example of a wired graph where the performance is very steady. And in all these graphs, you can click to just show the series that's of interest. So if you're just looking at TCP, you want to compare that to UDP, for example. These are all the same, so it's not that interesting. But when you start to get results where the graphs vary quite a bit, then it gets really interesting as well. So this is the other graph showing you where we combined functional testing with performance testing, and we see dramatic difference in results. So each one of these results here on the graph is an actual CDRouter test case. So you could click on any one of these. So if I click on one of these, and it'll bring you right to the actual test case that ran. And if I want to zoom in here, here is an example of we've started performance intervals here, where we got a couple streams, and now the device needs to do a DHCP renewal. And so we still see that happening on the WAN. So you'll see both these intervals reporting the bandwidth that it's measuring and the actual WAN activity as well. Likewise, if you were doing TR69, I have some other examples where with TR69, you'll see the device needs to do a periodic inform. It's during the middle of a performance test, and it'll show up in your log here as well. Now, we've seen all kinds of interesting things surface with performance. I just want to show you a few examples. This is a performance graph here of a router that has really interesting behavior, and I'm just going to walk you through the results here. I'm just going to unselect these. And what we saw is if we look at TCP behavior, if you look at the rate here that we're getting, it's pretty close to the theoretical max that you would expect for a gig ETH. You might be able to get a little higher than this, but really with TCP, that's about what you're going to get on all the devices we've tested. So this is IPv4. If you compare that to IPv6, you'd actually see it be slightly lower, and that makes sense too because you're consuming a little more headers space with IPv6, so your theoretical max bandwidth is a little bit lower. But what's really interesting is when you look at UDP, UDP is way lower, and that's unusual. Usually we see UDP is a lot higher. But when you look at IPv6 UDP, so that's v4, IPv6 UDP is where we'd expect. It's actually a little bit greater than TCP for both v4 and v6. So there's something about this v4 UDP path where the performance is really much slower than expected. And if we add back in these other ones, you'll see that one of the other V6 UDPs also has a lower performance down here as well. So it's a kind of peculiar behavior, and it would probably warrant somebody looking into why is that? What is the path here for these UDP connections? What is causing it to be much lower performance than my TCP behavior? So these are the types of problems that you could look at using our new CDRouter Performance. I'm going to go back and do one more live example here, where I ran this performance test earlier with wireless here. I'm just going to go in and show you the config, because I haven't done that yet, and show you what it's like to configure one of these devices, or configure the performance. You'll see there's a new section in your config file called CDRouter Performance add-on. If you expand that, you'll see the number of test vars that will control the behavior. The one you're going to want to look at here, perf duration, specifies how long you want to run the performance tests. So by default, you can run this from just 1 second. Looks like we have a maximum value here of 3,600 seconds for a duration. You can repeat these tests as many times as you want. So what will happen is each time you run it, that's when we'll perform a pass-fail on this test, but you can do that multiple times. You can enable capture files if you want to do that. We have a few other things to tweak the behavior here of the performance. And we've split up a download section and an upload section. So this supports devices that are going to have asymmetric bandwidth, things like DSL and cable, where you might want to set some thresholds in different directions, and you can do that here. We also have a high and low threshold, so you can set up QoS rules. So if you're expecting this performance test to not go above a certain high threshold, if you configure this, defaults to 0, which means you don't care. If you configure this, then we will fail a test if the bandwidth goes above a certain amount. But just to give you an example, I'm going to change the number of streams here to, looks like it was set to 10. I'm just going to set this to 20. Save this, and I'm just going to start this up. So what we'd be expecting is, if you are an existing customer, you could go in to modify your existing packages and add performance in there, or maybe create new ones where you'd combine some of these performance tests with specific functional tests that you care about. You may set up rules to say run these a specific number of times. What happens is every iteration of one of these test cases, we produce a result, like a bandwidth metric. And when you go into visualize at the end of your test run, you can graph all those together. And that's what gives you that graphing and trending behavior. It lets you kind of see over time what's actually happening. So if I look at this log, I should be starting my performance tests. And you'll see I now have 20 intervals. I'm logging these in 1 second intervals. You could back this off to 5 seconds or 10 seconds. We automatically back it off by default if you're doing longer test runs. So if you're running longer intervals, you may not want to see what's going on every second. So that should produce, and what will happen is at the very end, I'm just going to stop the auto update. At the very end, CDRouter will dump all the intervals together, but we'll also go in and verify. So we'll take the summary bandwidth and we'll check it against our target goal. In this case, we have a low threshold of just 10 megabits per second. So we're not going to fail this test. But you can imagine you're running something here with a more realistic threshold, and you're running it over the weekend or over a 24-hour period. You'd want to know if your bandwidth is dropping down, and you'd want it to be reported. So we can do that here by setting these thresholds. So I'm just going to stop this. Earlier, go into the results. Earlier I showed you how this can work with Cloud Shark. So if I wanted to deal with my capture files a little bit more, it's really easy to do that in Cloud Shark. I'll just show you a quick example where I'm going to go into our graphs here, create a new graph. And so here's a graph of the bandwidth being used. If I wanted to graph, for example, individual TCP streams, I could do that. I'll just graph a couple here. And I might want to change these to spline. And I'm just going to save this here. And you'll see that would let me, I can zoom in now on what's going on here. That would let me take a look at what's happening in another view during my performance test. So if I cared about my individual streams, I can go in and do that. Other thing I forgot to do is change that to second intervals, so you can see what's happening. And because this is, again, originating on wireless, you see it is very choppy as your wireless bandwidth grows and contracts based on other things. Something to consider if you're doing wireless performance testing, your environment, you need to consider what the impact is. Here we have a number of devices that are very chirpy and doing a lot of things, and it definitely has an impact on what we're doing. So I'm going to go back to the presentation, and we'll be taking questions here in just a moment. But I wanted to kind of summarize what we're looking at. You know, this is really just the starting point for us. This is a whole new capability for adding performance. We're planning to add more applications, more WAN modes, more unique streams. We're supporting our existing NTA 1000 hardware right now. So that gives us 1 gigabyte Ethernet interfaces, and it gives us up to 802.11ac wireless cards. You might have an older system that has just an N card in it. But we're supporting existing hardware, so it makes it really easy for you to take what you have today and do performance testing on it. We'll be increasing the capacity as we move forward with more robust systems that can handle larger workloads. And so you'll see in the future we'll be able to offer additional platforms that can scale up the performance that you're actually doing. So for existing customers, just to summarize what you'll be doing, CDRouter Performance is something that's enabled in your license. It's a new add-on for us. You'll be able to select your test cases just like your other modules. You'll be selecting performance test cases right in your config. And you can customize the behavior of those test cases. So you can set pass-fail criteria right in your configuration file. It's really the same user experience that you're familiar with CDRouter. So it should not be much of a jump for you to incorporate this type of performance testing into your functional testing. So some next steps from us. If you're interested, we are looking for early customers who want to try to get access to CDRouter Performance earlier rather than later. But we are expecting the first release to be very soon here. Next month, we're planning to release this to the general public. So it should be coming out right away. And you can start performance testing with CDRouter. So it's really going to give you one tool to tackle both functional and performance testing. It's a great environment for addressing both sides of that testing problem. So I'm going to go over now to the console, take a look at questions. So this is the moment if you have any questions. There's a question related to what is the max throughput of the system. We do support up to gigabit interfaces, so we can do line rate on gigabit, and that's that's as fast as our interface can go. So that's really what we're talking about is gig to gig performance testing. We'll be expanding that as we go here. The first iteration of CDRouter Performance is talking about testing from a single LAN interface to a single WAN interface. We can scale up the number of streams across that, but we're only doing a single LAN to WAN. If you have multi-port, you can set up a config that will cycle through all of your LAN interfaces, but you're only doing that one at a time. So we'll be expanding on that capability as we go. There was also a question about TR69 testing and how that would work together. And just to illustrate that point a little bit, I'm gonna switch back over to my system because I do have a TR69 set up here somewhere. Just as an example, how I combined one of our OD128 tests with a couple performance tests, and I ran this for 10 hours. So we're looking at what happens with the get parameter values, and does performance actually impact that at all? So if you look at the actual test case, it's pretty simple here. I'm just doing a get parameter values on the top level and looking at everything that comes back. This is a pretty slow speed DSLAM that we're using. It's just an older ADSL. And if I look at these results, what's interesting is this device actually fails the OD128 once in a while, and it's related to the content length being incorrect. But generally kind of keeps working okay. And if you look at the performance actually doesn't seem to be impacted in this case. It's ADSL, so you see it's asymmetric. The upload, which is down here in red, is lower throughput than the download, which is up here. If we look at one of these logs, just to show you what that looks like, while we're doing an actual performance test, you'll see TR69 activity. This router is doing a periodic inform. So while we're doing a performance test, it's actually showing up here. Okay, there's a question about the system for running performance on their minimum system requirements. We are locking this to our NTAs. So you would need an NTA from us. It's got to be a V2, V3, or V4. We're not supporting the V1s, but that goes back quite a few years. If you have a V1, it's probably time to replace that system anyways. And we are looking at application throughput. So we're not claiming to be in the same league as a packet blaster that can do RFC 25, 44, 64-byte packets at line rate. That's really not what CDRouter Performance is all about. You can adjust the size of the packet. So for the UDP tests, you can drop it down and send small frame packets. But our system is not going to be able to do line rate at 64-byte packets with the hardware that we're using. But at large frame sizes, we can. And that's really where our focus has been. So if you need control over the lowest level, for example, if you want to know precisely how many bytes you're sending in your interframe gap and really low-level hardware requirements, same thing on the wireless side, you might still want to use specialized performance test tools. But when you're ready to test performance in a more application perspective, CDRouter Performance is a perfect tool for that. It's going to allow you to do it with all your functional tests in a realistic way. Most of applications today are using larger frames. If you look at streaming and video streaming today, it's mostly done over TCP. And so we're looking at trying to mimic those real environments and not so much the small frames. Okay, there's another question about how to run the performance tests and the functional tests together. What you're doing would be you'd be selecting these tests, you're running them one at a time. So we're not doing it simultaneously, not yet. So that's something we're looking at, how to place background load on the device while we're doing the functional test. But you'd effectively be running a functional test, then a performance test. And you might be looping this together. And the performance test might only be 10 seconds. You might just be checking line rate over 10 seconds. What we've seen is this is still a very interesting way to gauge what's happening, and it allows us to show a number of devices that will degrade over time. The very common problem is memory fragmentation. You end up with a device limited memory, and the memory gets chewed up by functional exercises that happen over and over again, and the performance ultimately degrades over time. And so that's an example of a type of problem that would show up using CDRouter Performance. Well, I want to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. If you would like us to get in touch with you, just ping us and we'll try to follow up with you. Again, we're looking for early customers who would like to try this out, and we'll be circling around with that. It's just the beginning for us on addressing performance, and so we're excited to have this capability now that we can combine with CDRouter. All right, thanks again, and we'll talk to you shortly. Bye now.